Well, hello and welcome to Stir and Fry. This channel is about getting deep into the symbolism of horror films and what they show us about our deepest fears. And I'm delighted to say I'm joined by Josh Larson. Josh, welcome to the channel.
Hey, Thomas. Thank you so much for the invite. I'm looking forward to this conversation.
Where are you calling from today?
Calling from Chicago. That's my home base, and more specifically, calling from my closet. We moved a few years ago to the city itself from an outlying suburb, and so a little smaller space than we had before, and thankfully a closet that's big enough to stand in and record podcasts and shows like this. So it's working out so far, though you might hear our new 8-month-old puppy yelping in the background. That sometimes happens. Hopefully she'll be quiet.
Oh, amazing. You got some cool memorabilia going on in the background there as well.
Yeah. A big enough closet I can hang some pictures up there, and those are original illustrations that we had commissioned for Think Christian for the Theology of Star Wars ebook we put out a number of years ago. And so we had Skylar Rosaboom, a graphic designer, make those for each of the 9 theatrically released Skywalker films. And honestly, I love how the articles in that ebook turned out, but my favorite part were these illustrations. They're pretty cool.
Now, you've written this book called Fear Not, A Christian Appreciation of Horror Movies, and this is genuinely the book that I've been hoping for years, basically. I recommend everyone who watches this channel and enjoys getting into the theology of horror films, check out this book, because it's a pretty niche area, isn't it? I don't know if I'm just finding more now that I'm interested in it, but it feels like a lot of people are beginning to wake up to this. So how did you come to write this book?
Yeah, well, thank you. First of all, I hope it meets those expectations. And I think you're right. You know, there's been a growing interest over recent years, and horror itself goes through ups and downs in terms of popularity. I don't think it will ever leave the popular consciousness as a genre, but we do seem really, since maybe Get Out, Jordan Peele's Get Out, a fresh blooming in horror, different voices entering the genre, and it is quite popular right now, I would say. So this book, Fear Not, I've always been a fan of horror for many, many, many years, and I did write a post at Think Christian, which is our faith and pop culture media ministry, I think it was around 2015, that offered a very bare bones Christian defense of horror because it was a genre I liked, and because, our mission at Think Christian is to look at everything through a faithful lens. I thought, well, let's do this through horror. And it was the first time I sat down and started thinking about it that way, and came up with a basic sketch, an outline, I think, of how we might be able to do that. And then fast forward a couple of years, and some folks at Fuller Theological Seminary, which is based in Pasadena, California, I knew some of them. They knew about my interest in horror. They have a monograph series called the Real Spirituality Monograph Series. They've done a number of titles, just faithful engagement with film. And they had in the back of their minds that it would be good to, speaking to your desire for something like this. They were aware that there was interest from Christian cinephiles to have something reflecting on the horror genre specifically. So it was something of a commissioned project. They were also aware of my previous book, Movies Are Prayers, so they knew I'd done a book before. And we collaborated on how to go about this, what it might look like, how it would serve that need, essentially be something that could offer to those Christians who have been looking, like yourself, for something on the horror genre because it's a genre that they appreciate, but also a starting point for film fans who have been a little skeptical or a little timid when it comes to horror, and make the argument for why it is it's not a genre that should be tossed out for Christian film fans. It should be given same due consideration. Doesn't mean everyone has to watch it. Doesn't mean that, we're saying you're a bad Christian cinephile if you don't care for horror, but it deserves at least consideration. So that's what the project set out to do.
And I heard you on the Film Spotting podcast recently when you were kind of announcing the book, that you were saying a lot of people have analysed horror from a cultural perspective. You might find analysis from a feminist perspective, all sorts of perspectives, historic, psychological. So what do you think, if we were to argue more generally now, kind of outside the church perhaps, what might the possible value of getting into the theology of horror be?
I think, I found since I started reading film criticism passionately, I don't know, maybe middle school, high school, that I was drawn to critics who were great writers, first of all. Not necessarily, I didn't need to share their taste. I wanted to read people who were great writers. But then also I would eventually get drawn to folks who came from different backgrounds than I did, or were particularly interested in particular points of view when it comes to movies, because they would offer fresh interpretations of those films. And that's what I'm looking for in criticism, right? Is something fresh, something new, something interesting. So that's where, as you say, I might be interested in a particularly feminist take on a movie like Barbie, for instance, would absolutely apply. And if you enjoy reading interpretations of film from others' perspectives, maybe you share that perspective somewhat, but just to see it through different eyes, then that's what we're trying to offer here with Fear Not, is what would a Christian viewer who is open to the genre, I think most people would think immediately, well, they're just going to point out what's bad about it. And that's why we put appreciation in the subtitle. We're doing something differently here. So if you're interested in learning what a Christian viewer who had an open posture towards horror might make of the genre, I think you'll find that this book will open your eyes to how horror can be perceived. Just the way, you might read a class interpretation of horror. What does horror maybe reveal about different social classes? I'm sure a book could be written from that lens. This is just a different lens that can be applied.
And I think the nature of horror is that, in a sense, you can't help but discuss theology. It's kind of what the films are raising. So especially if you're watching supernatural horror like The Exorcist or something, or even The Witch, which I saw with my friend Rory the other day. He actually gave me your book, Movies Are Prayers. So that's kind of how I discovered your work.
Well, thanks, Rory.
Yeah. Shout out to Rory. But yeah, we were watching The Witch, and just the fact that, we even read out a Robert Eggers quote where he was saying something along the lines of he envies medieval craftsmen because they were making their work for a higher purpose and, doing an altarpiece. It's not just about your artistic ego. You're actually making this for the glory of someone. And he was sort of expressing a sense of, I wish that, filmmaking nowadays wasn't just about, the auteur and, your artistic vision kind of thing. So he was almost crying out for just a kind of theological lens to approach filmmaking. And I think you see that in The Witch. The view of the characters is that everything is significant. Nothing is arbitrary, but that the world actually means something. It's not just a machine grinding along. And I think horror forces us to kind of look at the world from that perspective, would you say?
Yeah, I even include an Eggers quote along those lines in the book that speaks more to this latter element you were just talking about, is his appreciation for earlier times. And all three of his films now, The Witch and The Northman and The Lighthouse, are set in previous eras. Eras where there wasn't a wall between the earthly and the spiritual, right? Most people lived in a time where every day there were permutations they felt between those two things. And now we're in a more rational, postmodern, scientific, prove it scientifically or it doesn't exist age. And his quote was something to the effect of, that's kind of boring compared to, stories you could tell where there is more of that piercing, that looking behind the veil. And I think that's what makes his films so fascinating. And you're right. It's also why it would almost be egregious to not apply a theological lens to horror, because the genre that I would place something like The Witch in and The Exorcist is religious horror, because it is tackling specifically religious themes or is taking place in religious context, as both of those films are. And what those movies do are forcing the viewer to confront, or at least consider, the possibility that the spiritual realm is actually a real thing. And The Exorcist is interesting in this case because it is very much about science versus the belief in something more, right? When we watch that narrative, how they try to treat the daughter first scientifically, and everyone's making, giving explanations for what could be happening that is scientific, not supernatural. And so, yes, so many horror movies, even beyond religious horror, but particularly religious horror, are forcing us to ask that question: is what we're seeing on the screen, of course, it's fiction created, but is it revealing a spiritual realm that I need to consider?
Yeah, and it's perfectly possible to imagine a very kind of postmodern telling of a religious horror film where, for instance, if you were to do The Witch, you might say, you might tell the film in such a way that actually there's nothing really supernatural that's going along. It's just entirely the superstitions of the Christian characters, and therefore we need to move away from this view that leads to such beliefs. Interestingly, The Witch doesn't go for that route. The characters do have kind of unhelpful suspicions towards one another, and it's a bit of a blame game kind of thing.
Yeah.
But at no point is there any denial that sorcery is real and dangerous and not something to be meddled with. And we see the kind of hellish vision of what these witches are like with the baby, that was captured. And so it's really interesting, isn't it, that Robert Eggers has continued to entertain the supernatural.
Yeah, that's a
whether
distinct
it's
choice.
His actual belief or not. But
Right. A distinct choice he makes with The Witch in the first, I don't know how many minutes, but, probably 10 minutes of the film. This family that has isolated themselves away from their community to a new farmstead, notably because the community is not fundamentalist enough in their religious beliefs. Within the first 10 minutes or so, the baby in the family is kidnapped, and Eggers shows us the witch, to your point, shows us what happens, shoves that in our face. So it is not going to be one of these psychological horror films where we wonder, is this character suffering from a breakdown and that's why they're seeing these things? He wants us to know right from the start, no, there's something out there. And then what the family wrestles with is how are they going to respond to that? With blame, with paranoia, with guilt. This is where their religious background comes into play. But yeah, you're right. There's no doubt that witch is real right from the start.
Now, just on are other people getting into this area? So I'm sure you're probably aware there's a podcast that's coming up from Christianity Today, who did The Rise and Fall of Mars Hill, and it's called Be Afraid, hosted by Dr. Cutter Calloway. I mean, only the trailer has come out, so I guess we can only guess what the main kind of thrust of the podcast is going to be at this stage. But I just think it's quite an interesting companion piece with your book, because it's called Be Afraid and your book is called Fear Not.
Right.
So, what am I to do with that, Josh? What is the place for fear in the Christian life? Can both be true at the same time?
So it's interesting. That's a partnership with Christianity Today, as you mentioned, and Fuller Theological Seminary, actually, because Cutter was one of the editors on my book. So, yeah, he was well aware of the title of the book when they titled the podcast. So I thought that was interesting as well when I saw what they eventually named it. And I'm hoping, I think I made the cut. I did record with Cutter for one of those episodes when they come out. So hopefully I made the cut there. But yeah, those seem to be, two alternative opposing ideas. And Be Afraid is a play, one reason could be it's a play on a very famous phrase that Gina Davis says in the David Cronenberg film The Fly, starring Jeff Goldblum. There's a point there where she says to him, as he is succumbing to this horror in that movie, be afraid, be very afraid, something like that. So I like that it's a play there. The reason I went with fear not for the book is that's the phrase we see in Scripture, or a variation, do not be afraid. So many times, countless times, people are told in Scripture not to be afraid. In some cases,
by angels a lot of the time.
By angels a lot of the time, right?
Yeah.
Announcing Christ's birth, telling that to the shepherds, also telling some incredulous followers after the resurrection that they should not be afraid. Jesus says it himself at one point. And so, yes, we're continually told in the Bible, fear not. I think sometimes as Christians, if you want to write off the horror genre, you would say, we're told to fear not in the Bible. So that means let's not think about it. Let's just move ahead to the comfort that the gospel offers and why we're told not to fear. But to me, that's shortcutting things. We first have to consider why the Bible says, fear not. It doesn't say that out of nowhere. It says that because the Bible is full of horror. And some of this is explicit, such as Cain murdering Abel, in the first couple chapters of the Bible. And some of it is more existential. The Bible addresses death and bodily decay, these things that haunt us, especially once we get to a certain point in our lives, almost every day, existentially. The Bible addresses that. So the Bible doesn't turn a blind eye to horror. And this is where I see the horror genre as coming alongside that function in Scripture and forcing us to confront some of those fears. And that can have therapeutic results. That can, depending on who you are as a viewer, you'll respond to that in different ways. But I think that's where the horror genre has value and works alongside the Bible. First, we got to talk about, why are we fearful? What makes us fearful? What does it say about us? What does that say about the broken, fallen world? Then we can get to why Scripture also tells us to fear not.
Yeah, and I think you do a brilliant job of that in the book in terms of looking at the subgenres of horror and how those kind of explore different fears that a lot of people have. And so you've got monster movies, zombies, creature features, slashers, religious horror, sex and death, found footage, body horror, prophetic horror, psychological horror, and ghost stories. And so were there any chapters that came easily and you kind of just almost before you wrote the book, you were like, I'm passionate about that subgenre. I know what I'm going to write for that. And then were there some that were really hard to write? I'd be
Great
interested
question.
to hear what the process was like.
Yeah. Well, and it wasn't just, my interest in the subgenre, because the guiding principle behind the book was to use those subgenres to suggest that each of them, again, similar to the Bible, explore a particular type of fear. Not every movie in the zombie genre explores the same type of fear, but I gathered together among the ones I've seen, is there a commonality? Is there a fear that they do tend to explore? And then I would talk about those films. And as we were just saying, I would recognize, well, here's where that fear is explored in the Bible. And here's where the Bible offers the gospel comfort, why we're told to fear not. And then in some cases, I would find a horror film that echoes that gospel comfort. Not all the time. The horror genre, these movies tend to add badly. So that's generally where things go. But sometimes you could see a hint of that gospel comfort. So I had that element in my mind too, in terms of your question of what was the easiest and what was the hardest to write. Something like zombies, I think did come relatively easy. And it is one of my favorite subgenres because to me, that fear was so clear. And the way I describe it in the book is fear of losing our individuality. But a more theological term we could put to that is fear of losing our imago Dei, this fact that we have been created individually, but also in the image of God. That's how Christians think about individuality, is that in the womb we were knit in a particular way, modeled after the image of God, but also as our distinct selves. And this is the scariest thing that's lost in zombie movies. They're very gruesome, they're very gory, but for me, it's always that moment where one of the characters has been bitten by a zombie and begins to change themselves into one of the undead. That's the visceral fear of being a zombie. Isn't that you're going to die, right? It's that you're going to turn into this automaton. You're going to lose all your individuality, everything that made you distinct. You're going to become part of this horde. And for a Christian, there's an added fear, is what we're losing there as well is the imago Dei. So that one came fairly easy. And once I started revisiting some of my favorite zombie films, like Night of the Living Dead, the great-great-grandfather of them, or caught up with some recent ones that I hadn't seen before, from Korea, Train to Busan, is amazing. That one also I found is playing with some of these ideas as well. So that one came relatively easy. I'll tell you quickly the hardest one was found footage. And this goes to my point. Found footage horror is among my favorite subgenres. So something like the Blair Witch Project or Paranormal Activity, these movies that purport to be footage that was just gathered by someone thrown up on the screen without context, and we make of it what we will. And I love those films, but I thought, what do they share in common in terms of exploring a fear, and how is that echoed in the Bible, and how does the Bible offer gospel hope in response to that? I ended up circling on fear of the dark as the found footage fear, which sounds obvious, but if you think about found footage, it's all about what we don't see, what's outside of the frame of the film. We can hear it maybe, but because we're dealing with a fixed camera, often we can't see it. And that represents all the things we don't know as limited mortal beings. Yet we're grasping for that knowledge of God, the omniscience of God. And the gap between those two is what I think found footage films do explore. So then it was just a matter of revisiting again some of those favorites and tying some of those threads together, which was a real challenge. I had to reach out to my editors and some friends who love horror and other people to kind of get my way through that chapter. But I'm pretty happy with how it turned out.
Yeah, I think it's amazing. And yeah, I agree with you. The Blair Witch Project, I think, is the most scared I've been in a film.
I believe it.
I remember seeing it. Yeah, I think I saw it on a laptop, which in some ways is the best way to see it, because it's like you've just unearthed this hard drive of footage. So I was watching it on my laptop at sort of 8 a.m. or something, and it's agony, isn't it? Just the shots of the trees.
Yes.
And I mean, I'll insert a little spoiler warning, because in case you maybe just cover your ears just for the next few seconds if you haven't seen it yet. But the weird thing about the Blair Witch Project is nothing really happens in some ways. I mean, you get lots of hints, but at no point does anything jump out, which is, I think, just such an incredible achievement about it, isn't it? Is that it's all done through what you don't see, to your point about darkness.
Absolutely. Yeah, the craft in that film does not get discussed enough by Eduardo Sanchez and, Myrick is his last name. I'm forgetting. I think Daniel Myrick, co-directors on this. It was a first film for them. And, it looks rough-edged because it's supposed to. But when you realize the choices that are being made about what rough-edged images to actually use and the use of sound in this, it's just, so brilliant. And to what we were saying earlier about The Witch, I think you're right. You could make an argument that there's maybe nothing out there in those woods with these filmmakers camping, trying to make a documentary about a legend of a local witch. Maybe it's just some, local people messing with them. And how are they going to respond to that? I don't know that we see anything specifically on the screen that would suggest there is a Blair Witch at all. And that's one of the, to my mind, wonderful ambiguities about that movie.
Did you have any other kind of sort of hidden gems that you discovered in your research for the book? Any new favorite horror films?
New favorites. I would say a newly appreciated, and I'm going to point to Ganja and Hess, which is, I believe, 1973. The writer and director Bill Gunn. This was a movie I'd seen a number of years ago. You mentioned Film Spotting, which is a mainstream film podcast and radio show that I'm a co-host on. But we did a blaxploitation marathon a number of years ago, and Ganja and Hess was part of that. And I saw it then, appreciated it, but was somewhat bewildered by it. It is this film that mixes Western American Christianity, the Black Church in particular, elements of the Black Church, with a made-up for the film African religion. And it's an anthropological professor who is the main character. He's in the States. He gets stabbed by this dagger that has been brought back from Africa, that is part of this African religion, and turns him into something of a vampire, something of a zombie in some ways. It's very much its own thing. And revisiting it again for Fear Not, where I placed it in the religious horror subgenre, I began to appreciate it more because the bewilderment, I understood why it was all working together formally. This is a movie that very much feels like a fever dream in its editing, the shot selection, the use of music. And I could see, again, going back to Blair Witch, the creative choices being made about how to intermingle these two expressions of faith and religion and belief in a spiritual realm, and what they were suggesting. So I see Ganja and Hess more of a piece now than I did the first time, and I'm grateful for that. Too often, even as movie critics, we don't get a chance to go back and revisit films, especially the ones that we feel like we missed something with them. And so anytime I get a chance to do that, I find, I'm almost always rewarded because it's almost always me, not the film. It's I need to find something else there that I just wasn't able to grasp that first time around. So yeah, not a new discovery for me, but a new appreciation would be Ganja and Hess.
That's something I really appreciate about the work of film critics like yourself, actually, is kind of drawing our attention to maybe things that might not be so well known, but are really worth seeing. So in a sense, the whole reason I got into horror in the first place, it's Mark Kermode's fault.
Oh, sure.
I don't know if you follow much of his work, but
huge Exorcist
he
fan.
is. Oh yeah, The Exorcist is his favorite film, isn't it?
Yep.
So he's seen it several hundred times, and I think I remember that was when I wasn't into horror at all when I heard about that, and that kind of made me think, oh, okay, well, maybe there's something in it. Maybe I should check out some of these films, and off I went. But you have mixed feelings about The Exorcist, don't you?
I do, and Mark and I didn't get into a big debate about that. He was kind enough when I was out your way to have me on for a video interview he did for my first book, Movies Are Prayers. And so we were mostly talking about that, but The Exorcist did come up, and yeah, I'm very conflicted about it. Every time I watch it, I get a little closer to appreciating it more, but that central sticking point is still there for me, where I just sense a tension of sensibilities. There is, the Blatty novel it's based on, I have not read yet. Someday I have to do that, and maybe it'll help resolve some of this to me. But there seems a more genuine interest in the religious questions at the heart of that film in some parts, about this priest who is having a crisis of faith himself and is himself skeptical about what is happening to this little girl. He also turns to reason and science first. And there's a genuine interest throughout the film that you can sense in that question. And then, and I don't want to entirely blame this on the director, William Friedkin, who actually just passed about a month and a half ago now, I think. But there is this sensibility of going for the jugular in those possession scenes that the other elements for me fall by the wayside. And it's an incredibly well-crafted film. It's very scary. It has a lot of elements of a good horror movie, but there's a dissonance for me at the heart of it that every time I watch it, it still holds me back just from naming it as one of my favorite horror films, which I know a lot of people do. So I get a lot of pushback on this viewpoint.
That's really fascinating. Have you seen the documentary that William Friedkin made? I think it's called The Devil and Father Amorth.
I have not. No, I haven't.
Yeah, so Mark Kermode was a co-writer on that, I think. And that was quite interesting, as sort of in a later stage of his life, William Friedkin going to witness what was supposedly an actual exorcism by the chief exorcist of the Vatican. And it's interesting. He kind of keeps his cards fairly close to his chest in that documentary, but you get the sense that he's kind of entertaining the possibility, okay, something that I can't explain is going on here. So yeah, it's really interesting, isn't it? But The Exorcist as a cultural kind of phenomenon, and the fact that people were carried out of the cinema when it was shown for the first time, I mean, it really shook the world, didn't it?
Yeah, and it's a common answer, now that I'm getting out talking about the book in live events and so forth. If you have to talk to people, the scariest movie you ever saw, that one will come up quite a bit.
I'm sure Mark is nervous about the new one that's coming out.
I know. I'm very curious about it. I'm not an Exorcist completist in terms of the other films that have been made, but I am interested in checking this one out. I think I'm actually traveling when there's a Chicago press screening, so I might have to catch it a bit later. But yeah, we'll see what David Gordon Green does with that one. I don't know that his Halloween reimaginings were all that successful for me, so I don't know. I'm not going to have too high of expectations for this one, but we'll see.
Josh, you've been so generous with your time. Can I just ask you a little bit about Psycho, which is another film which shook the world? Because on this channel, I've been working through the top 10 horror films on Rolling Stone magazine's list. Now, these lists aren't everything, but I think they're quite interesting just to see which films are considered to be the classics. And Psycho was at number 2, so I did a video about that recently. But I'd love to hear your thoughts on Psycho, just maybe why you think Psycho has lodged itself in our memories as a landmark horror film.
Yeah, no reservations on Psycho from me. I do think it's one of the 10 best. I forget where I have it ranked in my list. But why has it lasted? You know, at this point, it's by reputation of that twist that happens so early in the film, which I suppose, you know, we should be able to spoil, but even if there's one person who sees this and has not watched Psycho, I don't want to, because it's so integral to what's special about that movie. So I think it has that going for it. I think it has one of the best horror performances of all time in Anthony Perkins as this lonely motel manager. I think that speaks to it. And it's just maybe the pinnacle of manipulation by Alfred Hitchcock as a director in terms of audience manipulation. This was his great gift. Every choice, again, creative choice that is made to somehow push the audience to a place he wants them to be. And Psycho is incredibly effective at this. And often that involves with Hitchcock making us feel guilty, aligning us with the guilty in the movie. Again, the twist is interesting in this way, how we are moved. I think there's a guilt transference, I'll just say, among characters with that twist that makes us feel we are in on the crime in Psycho. And I think a movie like that is going to stick to someone's guts a lot longer than just seeing the bad guy stopped or punished. So all of that comes together, I think, to make what is absolutely a classic. On top of, I mean, I know you would love to just talk forever and ever about Bernard Herrmann's score, I imagine, and the way that is employed. I know when we did revisit Psycho about, maybe it was within the last year on Film Spotting, I went on a long diatribe trying to trace the use of the stabbing strings in that score throughout the movie, and marking where Hitchcock chose to put them and what that indicated. I'm not going to go into that now because, yeah, as you said, we're running out of time, but track down that Film Spotting episode and you can hear me talk about that. But Bernard Herrmann's score is another reason. You need that too, right? To become an iconic classic film. Generally, you'll find that they have themes that you say the title of the movie, and even a casual moviegoer, if they've seen it, will start hearing the music in their head. And I think that happens with Psycho.
Amazing. Oh, I've got to check that episode out. Well, Josh, it's been an absolute pleasure having you on the channel. I've been really blessed by your work. Where can people, first of all, buy this amazing book, and secondly, catch up with you and what you're doing?
Well, thank you. Thanks, Thomas. This has been a really good conversation. Yeah, for UK viewers and listeners, you know, The Big Place, I believe, has it for order. I know, you know, here in the US, we have an independent bookseller connected website called bookshop.org. So they support local independent booksellers. So if you try to make that a priority, I'm not sure if there's a UK equivalent or if that website might point you somewhere, but that's an option as well. And yeah, that's where you can find Fear Not, Christian Appreciation of Horror Movies, as well as my first book, Movies Are Prayers. And if you want to connect with me on the internet, I'm on various social media platforms as Larsen on Film, Larsen on Film. Otherwise, most of my work shows up at Think Christian or on Film Spotting.
Amazing. Well, Josh Larsen, thank you very much.
Thanks again, Thomas.